wonderful new book called Threads of Peace. It is a story of both Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King. That she goes through both of their lives and their journeys toward peace. And it is an amazing, amazing book. And it's such a privilege to get to talk to you about it, Uma. The first thing I have to ask before we get into the deeper questions, because it was the first thing on my mind when I saw the book, is how long did it take you to write it, from conception to book?
I actually went back and counted. Hi, Marion. It's really wonderful to talk to you about this book. You've been alongside for some of its journey, but it started 9 years ago, really. 9 years ago, I sent a proposal out and it got accepted. Now, if we want to go before that, there was a time when I thought it was going to be a picture book. So that's maybe a couple of years before that. So maybe it's sort of been in my mind cooking for about maybe 12 or 13 years, I'd say.
That's not at all surprising when you see the book and what you've accomplished with it. It's such an impressive undertaking, Uma. So many complications and so much ground to cover. How did you arrive at this structure, this approach, this particular way of telling the stories of your two subjects?
So I knew from the beginning that I would start with an episode from each of their lives. But this becomes complicated because I thought I'd try to interweave their stories. And that becomes really complicated because one lifespan runs from 1869 to 1948, and the other one goes from 1929 to 1968. So how was I supposed to handle the passage of time? It got really unwieldy. The one point at which their stories seem to pivot towards one another is in 1935, when a minister and scholar who would later become a mentor to Dr. King traveled to India and met with Gandhi. But I just soon found out that this grandiose idea I had of somehow telling the history of the idea by interweaving their life stories just wasn't going to work. There were just too many leaps and hops in time, and it was going to be really confusing. So I made this chart, and I will show it to you.
Oh,
okay.
How fascinating.
And it kind of shows both their lives, spins them out in terms of pivotal events in both their lives. I plotted it out, and then I made the central line that represented those ideas of and principles of nonviolent resistance and of building community. And I made the plot line, I shaped the plot line so that it contained events that moved both men closer to those ideals, and then events that put obstacles in their way. So you could sort of see the storyline going up and down as it related to that central, and just doing it visually in that way made me see that what I really needed was then to do a table of contents for myself, to look at what the actual sequence of the story was going to be. And so then it just sort of fell into place after that. But this was probably, a year or so after I had actually started writing and written this one big unwieldy draft that didn't cohere at all. So the way I have it now, you start with those two episodes, one from each of their lives. Then I lay out the Gandhi chapters in sequence, ending with his assassination, and then pick up King's life in 1948, when he's already in college. That is the year of Gandhi's assassination. And so it was really these organizers, the chart and the table of contents, that really helped me to develop the structure of this book. The other thing that contributed structure was the photographs. As I found more and more images, I was able to build both the text and the sidebars around them. And that was when the shape of the book really began to clarify in my mind.
Wow. Yeah.
It's a lot.
I am even more impressed as I hear you talk about your process, Uma. You're a fiction writer from picture books to through middle grade, and you've done some YA short stories as well and some poetry, right?
Mhm.
So how does a fiction writer go about writing a book like this?
Well, the truth is that this fiction writer, when she was confronted with a couple of years worth of research notes, once she had to pull her head out of the research and actually start writing, at that moment, this fiction writer was utterly terrified. I have to tell you that my first draft was stumbling, incoherent piece of work. It really lacked direction. It was written by a writer who didn't actually know who she was relative to the text. The truth is, I had read so widely that my head was filled with other people's voices, King's own voice and Gandhi's, and all of the scholars and biographers and people who had written, really erudite commentary on this huge, vast history that I was trying to pack into a book for young readers. And so I really had to put the research down and construct a voice that was my own. And it was really my editor, Caitlin DeLuey at Athenaeum, who reminded me that I should write this like a novel, that I did have the skills to do that. She said, you need to write it in scenes, you need to write it so it speaks and sings and shouts the way a novel might. And so then I thought, okay, well, I do know how to do that. So then I had to really back away from everything I'd read and think, what is this story? What is this central, theme? She said to me, you should write a thesis statement. And I thought about that a lot with my students' work, with writing critical essays. I had never thought about a thesis statement for my own creative work. But I wrote one, and it really made sense. So all of these ways, I think I was able to take my fiction writer mind and put it to work, writing this book that was all about real events. The one thing I did, one rule I made for myself was that I was simply not allowed to make up dialogue. So every piece of quoted speech in the book from these two men, and almost every other, barring maybe a couple of exclamations that I took liberties with in a crowd scene, for example. But otherwise, every piece of dialogue is authenticated in the book.
Mm-hmm. History seems so full of mistakes and misdeeds, violence and bigotry, exploitation, and on and on. So much grief. Why does it all matter for young people who didn't live through any of it?
I think precisely because they didn't live through any of it. It matters because young people will inherit, have inherited already in our time, the outcomes of history. And because we in the adult world are finally learning that if we don't look history in the eye and acknowledge the mistakes of the past, we're just going to hand all this horrible baggage down to young people. And that seems terribly unfair. So I think it's important to look not just at history, but to look at how we have spoken and thought about history up until now, which is as this, final constructed thing that's already done, and there's only one way of looking at it. And I thought no one has really looked at the connection between Gandhi and King in this way before, and it seemed very important to me to do that. I had grown up knowing a lot about Gandhi and the struggle for Indian independence. And, my mother had lived in Delhi at the time. She had actually gone to some of Gandhi's prayer meetings. So this was all the stuff of my childhood. These were stories that I heard as a child growing up. I had no idea about how this had disseminated to anywhere else in the world. And so when I found this book by Gerald Horne, who is a university professor in African American studies and history, it blew me away. It was about, it's called The End of Empires, African Americans and India. And it talked about this long history of between these two peoples on opposite ends of the world around, and some of it, a good chunk of it, around these very issues of struggles for voice and struggles for freedom and independence, and building community. So it just really seemed as if not only that it was a story that needed to be told, but that really was what made me dare to think that I might possibly be able to do that telling.
As you're saying that, it strikes me that it's such a natural pairing to look at Gandhi and King together. And it intrigues me that it hadn't really been done before in the way you've done it. When you're writing nonfiction, to find fresh territory like that is such a gift. You must have been thrilled at just looking at that and recognizing the place was there for you.
Thrilled and terrified. And I think that's why when I first started thinking about this, I thought about it in a very modest way. I thought it was going to be a picture book about the King's visit to India. Dr. King and Mrs. Coretta Scott King went to India in 1959, and that is now a chapter in the book. But I thought it was going to be a picture book about that, and that would then open up. And I had some idea that would suffice. But then when I started to write it and actually wrote the text for that, it just raised more questions than it was possible to answer within 32 pages or even 40 pages. There were all these questions about both histories that seemed necessary to answer, that the book wouldn't have worked without that. And that's when and I had been talking to my agent and to my editor about this, and my editor was the one who actually said, I can do this. I think we can publish this, but it's not a picture book. It's think about it as middle grade nonfiction, and I needed that. I needed to hear that.
What did writing this book do for you? What did you learn from it? How did you change?
I think as a writer, I learned that I didn't need the expertise of a historian to write this book, that I had expertise of my own. I think it was a validation of my own writing skills in the end to be able to work through this. I also learned a lot about how my writing mind works and how I can't write to an outline. I have to sort of go blind and see where the page takes me, and then go back and do more research and then come back and do this again. And then it changed me as a person, because I think time marched on and history was unfolding all around us. So during the edits of this book was when George Floyd was murdered, and the protests were all over where they started out in the States, and they went all around the world, and they remained largely peaceful. And I thought, there is a way for this story to have resonance in our time, because before that I had been feeling very discouraged. I had just been feeling that there was so much animosity and so much hatred in the world. And was there even a point to writing this story? My writing group had to talk me off that cliff once, and my editor did too. But I think when I began to hear the news reports, the news cycle sort of made me realize that there was a place for this. And it also made me realize that it was in sort of a story that didn't need to be finished, that finishing it wasn't the point. In fact, perhaps the point was to not finish it, but to end at a place where, we take these two lives and the gifts that we get from them, and we think about how we carry this out into the world. So I learned so much. It was a whole education for me writing this book.
That's wonderful, Uma. Something people who are listening to this probably won't know, because they won't have the book in their hands yet, is that you've included a chapter about the assassins. Why did you choose to do that?
That is such a great question. I think I think the truth is that you can't talk about peace without also talking about its opposite. You can't talk about violence. You can't talk about nonviolence without also speaking about violence. I think some things, like perhaps nonfiction too, right? I mean, you can't. We couldn't talk about nonfiction without also looking at my fiction writer's mind and how those things work. And maybe some things can't be talked about unless we also include a reference to their opposites. And so, because both their lives ended in such startlingly similar ways with assassins, I mean, with being shot by assassins, I began to wonder what those other lives were like. And because the book was beginning to be about, the threads of two stories intersecting, I couldn't not also write about those other very troubled, very difficult stories. There's also a little ambiguity there because there are lots of theories about the King assassination, and there are lots of ambiguities in both stories. In India today, Gandhi's assassin and Gandhi's own story are looked at in very, very different ways, and so I thought one way of allowing a little ambiguity into the text was to consider the lives of the assassins, and they were fascinating and incredibly dramatic, but they were difficult chapters to write just because of the events that they were dealing with.
Mhm. Okay, I'm going to draw the interview to a close with the topic of peace. And I'm going to start by telling an experience of mine. This was years ago. I was in a school speaking as the children's writer of the moment, and found out that the school had been identified as a peace school, and they were teaching peace throughout the school until some parents objected because peace was too political. And they were on the wrong side of the political fence with teaching peace, which just horrified me when I heard it. Should we teach peace? Can we teach peace? How do we go about it? Is there a way to teach peace that isn't just Pollyanna? Is there a way to teach peace? The question I ask myself again and again, because for me, this is a topic that comes up many times in my own work, is how do we teach peace in a way that's meaningful and realistic and still hopeful?
Yeah, I think part of the problem is that words like peace and like nature is the other analogy I can think of. These are very broad words, and they're very and they can it's very easy to lapse into feeling good about both those words. And I think also if you look at peace, it is if you look at both the lives of Gandhi and King, peace in a way was not the point. Justice was the point. Freedom was the point. Dealing with oppression was the point. And peace became a method. So nonviolence became a technique. It became a method. It became a set of principles that both men used and employed quite strategically. So all of this, we think about this as sort of the work of two heroes, but it was actually the work of a lot of people whose thinking and whose work went into building these movements. So I think that peace needs to be broken down if we're going to think about it and teach it. You can think about it in many ways. You can think about it as individual action, like how do we react to conflict in our own lives? How do we react to conflict one-to-one with other people? How do we deal with it in situations in a group? And the point of it shouldn't be to end the conflict. The point of it is to work through it in ways that are equitable and just, so that power is not taken by one person over another, by one group of people over another, by one community over another, and then I suppose at the world level by one country over another. So it's very interesting to me that King, when he was in India, was starting to think about world peace, and made his first speech about that during that time. It wasn't something he'd ever put his foot into before, and it wasn't appreciated by many people who heard him. But I think it's inevitable that if you think about peace in this way as a method, as something that is powerful and not passive. It's why I don't like the term passive resistance, because really there's nothing passive about it. You're putting your body into harm's way with a very deliberate purpose. You are not submitting to anyone by doing this. And I think everybody, down to the kids who ran out there to face the hoses, they knew that. And it was an active topic of conversation in the movement. And that's, I think, what I find so interesting about the American civil rights movement, is that it deliberately and intentionally took a set of principles and methods developed, by somebody halfway around the world, and people thought about it, and they thought about what out of that could be applied to the circumstances of Black people. The other thing I think that we've done historically is that we've sort of, it's easier to accept the peaceful side of or what is seen as the peaceful side of the civil rights movement, and less easy for society at large to accept that there were other expressions of the same urge for freedom and freedom from oppression. But these things were all interwoven, and it was all part of a bigger conversation. So I think we can only teach peace if we also place it in historical context, and we talk about power and its and how it operates, which is all of which is so terribly political. So I think peace is in fact political if you look at it, and if you don't, you sort of you're taking its power away.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh, Uma, thank you so much. For everybody out there who witnesses this, Threads of Peace is an amazing, challenging, fascinating book, and I hope you'll go out and find it. And thank you, Uma, very, very much.
Thank you, Marion. It's lovely to talk to you.
Thank you, Uma.
Thank
Carol.
you.
I can figure out how to.
Can you close that down without closing her down? I'd love to chat for a few minutes.
We can just open.